Welcome to the plenary session, The Future Energy Mix. My name is Keigo Akimoto, Chief Researcher at the Research Institute of Innovative Technology for the Earth, RITE, in Japan, and is the chair of this session. Deep emission reductions are strongly requested in the world, and the energy systems will be required to change drastically and rapidly. In order to meet deep emission reductions like net zero emissions, energy systems will be also complex. That is, hydrogen, ammonia, and synthetic fuels will be also important options, as well as CCUS technologies. In addition, the combinations of lumpy technologies and granular technologies, including energy demand side measures, should also be considered, particularly in the digitalization technology world. Systematic and comprehensive and quantitative analysis are needed for better understanding the possible future energy mix and barriers to be overcome. On the other hand, the world countries have different conditions in energy supply and demand potentially. I believe the transition is also an important topic, and energy security is also a really important issue for most nations, as well as energy supply costs, which have potential impacts on industrial competitiveness among nations. Energy mix is a global issue in terms of climate change mitigation and global energy supply, but also is a domestic issues in terms of competitiveness and energy security issues. So it is very important and very difficult issues how to consider such complex issues in the future energy mix. So I'd like to expect considering these issues from latest outlooks and views through the presentations and discussion. So, okay, I'd like to invite speakers. In this session, we have three distinguished speakers. The first speaker is Professor Karsten Neuhoff, who is a leader of the Climate Policy Department at the German Institute for Economic Research, DIW Veyrenc, and professor at the Institute for Economics and Law of Technical University Veyrenc. He will discuss the question of how industry policy determines the future energy mix. Please.
Hello, everybody. My name is Karsten Neuhoff from the German Institute for Economic Research and Technical University Berlin. And I'm very happy to discuss with you today how industry policy will determine the future energy mix. And to anchor this discussion, let me use one result from the new IAEA report, Net Zero by 2050, reassuring that also their analysts now find plausible pathways towards climate neutrality. And what you can see is in the three main sectors relevant for the energy questions, the transition to climate neutrality involves largely a shift to electric mobility and transport, to electric heating applications on the building sector. The picture looks a bit more mixed still in the industry, which is partially due to remaining projected use of fossil fuel in chemicals for plastic production. But you also see various elements coming up there, and particularly a strong component of electrification also in industry. Together, this will imply that there is an increase of electricity demand at the global scale from currently 20,000 terawatt hours to roughly 60,000 terawatt hours by 2050. Where will this increase happen? What is the timeline for these changes? Will depend on the development of the market in these areas. And that's what I would like to discuss with you. What will determine the electricity demand in the industry sector as they're shifting to climate neutrality? From the technology side, obviously industry is a very inhomogeneous group of actors where you have electricity used for engines, for heating purposes of buildings and low temperature heat. But 70% of industrial emissions are related to basic material production, steel, cement, chemicals. And therefore, let's focus for today on these 70% of industrial CO2 emissions and also the majority of the energy demand. If you look at one example, steel, we currently have glass oxygen furnaces, which use a bit more than half a ton of coal to make 1 ton of primary steel. And this can be replaced if you use 3.5 megawatt hours of electricity to make hydrogen, to direct reduce iron, and to make steel out of this. So that's the option that we see. Now, this option looks quite different if you compare to what we've observed in the past in terms of power generation. So we use 1 ton of coal to create 8 megawatt hours of electricity, which has 8 megawatt hours of energy, to create 3.5 megawatts of electricity, because coal power stations have efficiency losses in this transformation. And this has a big implication. While on steel making, moving to renewables saves us 55 euros of coal costs, shifting the same amount to on the electricity side saves us 100 euro of coal costs. So it makes it a lot easier on power generation side to break even for renewables at roughly 30 euros per megawatt hour with conventional coal on operational costs, while on the steel making, renewables would have to be available at 15 euros per megawatt hour to break even with the operational cost on the savings on the coal inputted into the process. So it's more complicated economically to create an environment for steel making to shift to climate neutral processes. This is reflected in a recent survey, which was now published in Climate Policy, looking at amongst European industry and experts of what are seen to be the main challenges for a transition to climate neutrality in the basic material sectors. And the lack of effective and predictable carbon pricing mechanisms was emphasized as by 80% of the responses in these interviews as the main objective to be addressed or challenged. Secondly, as you saw also from the picture, it takes a lot of clean electricity, renewable electricity to substitute, and therefore also limited availability of affordable green electricity was also often stated by almost half the participants as a main challenge going forward. Followed then by the regulatory framework for credibility, for circularity and other points. Secondly, I think the IAEA report also is interesting in the way that it acknowledges that to shift to climate neutrality, the demand side has a huge role to play. And if you look at the contribution of the demand side in the different sectors, you will see that the IAEA projects the biggest responses and the biggest contributions to emission savings, energy savings from changes of the demand side on the industry level, and in particularly savings on through material efficiency, more effective use of material. And this mirrors what our studies have shown in the past, that cars have become lighter because steel was more high value, and therefore you needed 20%, 25% less steel to deliver the same strength. Buildings, Julian Albert and his group shows how you can save 30, 40% of material input by more tailored building design across the entire process, and therefore save the corresponding energy needs and carbon emissions. Now, how do we unlock all these changes? Let me use a very simplistic picture to show the effects. So we have our conventional production and the objectives to kind of substitute the conventional production with clean production, but also to kind of use in manufacturing, in construction materials more efficiently, substitute with alternative materials with new ideas. And traditionally, carbon pricing has been seen as the main element of achieving this by leveraging a carbon cost on the production of materials, on the emissions there. Material producers have an incentive to improve efficiency. Conventional material production gets more expensive, creating market opportunities for clean production and the incentives in the value chain. We are here at the IAEA Global Conference, and obviously it's quite nice that we can trade globally. And as you can see, producers do export from Europe and import basic materials or products comprising basic materials. And this, however, implies that if carbon prices and carbon costs are significant, then basic material prices would increase, and one would limit the exports or increase imports due to the carbon pricing mechanism, shifting production to other regions and emissions to other regions, so-called carbon leakage. For this reason, free allowances have been granted for a long time in all systems now that have emission trading for industry. And these allowances are granted to producers of basic materials, and together with the tradability of the products imply that only a very small share of the carbon costs are reflected in materials, and all the incentives that were desired for creating space for clean production or material efficiencies are muted with the system. Now, CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, is a debate that has been there now for a while on the table. And the idea of a carbon border adjustment, as his economists love it, is to say, I directly move on, has been to kind of make adjustments at the border, and these adjustments would then correct for the pricing internally and externally. I think one needs to refine this to really effectively deliver some carbon pricing system. And so what, together with the research network Climate Strategies and partners in Europe and internationally, we think could be quite helpful is to leverage a climate contribution, a charge per ton of basic material production on conventional producers and on producers of clean materials. It's the weight of the material times the carbon intensity of this material times the EU ETS carbon price. This climate contribution gives then the incentives along the value chain for material efficiency, substitution, and recycling, while at the same time, a climate contribution is a excise charge, and all the established mechanisms for excise charges to adjust at the border can be used. So it is the liability for the excise charge is waived at the export and is created for imports. So the climate contribution doesn't create carbon leakage risks, but creates along the value chain the desired incentives. It creates revenues, which then can be used to pay for the incremental costs of clean production processes, to offer clean production processes carbon contracts for differences, which guarantee for a longer period a contribution to incremental for every ton of carbon saved from a clean process relative to the conventional process, to make the clean processes competitive with conventional processes. And the system would, in principle, imply that you have both conventional producers paying for CO2 certificates and for the climate contribution. So they would be exposed to double charging. To avoid double charging, conventional producers would then be granted free allowance allocation for their production process, and in exchange need to show a transition plan how they will shift their corporate production processes to climate neutral processes, such that it is clear this free allocation is an element of the transition to climate neutrality to avoid double charging throughout this process. This approach creates a lot of international opportunities. It avoids WTO uncertainties and controversies because it is based on a climate contribution as an excise charge, established procedure that works quite well. Secondly, it provides a policy example and financial resources to kind of show how this transition to climate neutrality can be supported with an effective carbon pricing mechanism, and therefore might encourage other countries to follow this path or kind of to further refine it to kind of meet their needs. Also, a share of a climate contribution revenues would, in countries like Europe or regions like Europe, be made available to support emerging economies in their transition to climate neutrality, particularly developing countries. And finally, it is a good basis on which then regions like Europe can engage internationally with other regions to decide and agree on, in a collaborative approach, on a minimum carbon price in this basic material sectors or in specific materials, or if desired on carbon clubs or sectoral agreements, whatever kind of mechanism is most suitable for this cooperation. So it's a basis which supports international cooperation as well. I just emphasized the role of carbon contracts for differences to support the investment into the clean facilities. And here you can see how they, at the end, help at different contexts to kind of reduce the carbon costs, and therefore the costs ultimately borne by consumers of shifting to clean processes. So the minimum carbon price that is required in the context of a carbon contract for differences reduces quite a bit compared to a system where an emissions trading system with a volatile carbon price is implemented and is not backed with a carbon contract for difference. Obviously, the strike price that is necessary for a clean facility to operate a competitiveness with a conventional facility depends on, as we saw at the beginning, the price at which clean electricity is made available and the investment costs. And here you see some scenarios to kind of differentiate this. A further dimension of effective carbon pricing, it does imply that carbon costs are reflected along the value chain. I think ultimately this is the objective of this economic instrument. And so we looked in terms of what does this mean for consumers? So in my country, in Germany, if we assume now a carbon price of 30 euro per ton is reflected across the entire value chain, then for the poorest household segments, their costs will increase by 0.15% across all their consumption products. The richer household segments have almost 0.2% cost increases because they tend to buy more motor vehicles, which are steel, aluminium, plastic intensive. But altogether, it's a very small cost increase. So carbon pricing on materials will not change final consumption choices very much, but it creates all the incentives along the value chain and for clean production processes to move forward. So let me broaden up again the discussion. So we want to understand what will drive the shift to electricity, to changes of fuels in the industry sector to understand future developments of the fuel mix. And to understand this again, let's go to our steel picture. We have a development of total demand for steel that is like steel services, so transport, buildings, housing, whatever it might be, that is likely going to increase also in the coming years and decades, hopefully with a successful further economic development. At the same time, we have an increasing share of scrap that is available, and we just emphasize the various role of demand-side responses that can reduce the need for steel to deliver these services. So products can be shared, repaired, reused. One can use higher value steel to kind of deliver the same strength with less material, more material efficiency. And ultimately, what is left then is the gap of primary production that will have to shift to clean processes into the future. So we will not have to replace the entire fleet of conventional steel production with clean steel production, but some of the conventional production will have to shift to clean steel production. I think this is an interesting development because it implies that once the process of shifting to clean steel production is started, every company, every country will put in an effort to make sure also some of their facilities are shifted to clean steel production and not running into the risk of being then otherwise phased out if there is no more need for clean production volumes in the future. This really implies this entire shift in the clean transition in the material sector is something that needs to be structured in an inclusive manner to make sure across all of our countries, in all of our industrial regions, some of the production of steel will be shifted to clean steel. And this really puts an emphasis on the different policy instruments to support this. One is ensuring this effective carbon pricing along the value chain, such that all material mitigation options are encouraged, and at the same time, resources are available to fund the clean steel production processes. Second, to address with all these elements around the uncertainties that are linked to new investments through creating lead markets using carbon contracts for differences. But also to creating local lead markets, particularly towards material efficiency, better building design, better infrastructure thinking, perhaps through public procurement. And finally, towards once there is sufficient clean steel available, zero carbon steel, zero carbon cement, and so on, then it will be quite natural to implement some phase-out strategy for remaining conventional capacity, and product carbon requirements can be defined that ban the sale of products in territories that are made out of carbon-intensive stuff. So the anticipation of this future product carbon requirements already implies that today's companies need to look in terms of how can they access clean basic materials, how can they offer clean basic materials, how can they engage in this transition to climate neutral production processes. So in summary, with this overall transition to climate neutrality, basic materials that comprise 70% of industrial emissions and therefore contribute perhaps the largest share of overall demand and also shifting of the demand towards clean fuels have a very important role to play. And as you can saw from the discussion, this involves both shifting to clean production processes, but also to enhance material efficiency, to better recycling, more high-value recycling, and all these components together. None of these developments will work and at sufficient scale and speed by itself. So it will depend on a lot of different policy instruments that are implemented at the national level and perhaps with some global cooperation towards achieving this transition to climate neutrality. And it will therefore be very important to assess how these policy instruments work, to encourage countries to effectively implement these policy instruments, and ultimately work together to their implementation. I think this is possible. I pointed out at the beginning, clean production processes are a bit more expensive, but at the end showed actually it's not so much more expensive once you look at the total cost for final consumers. So countries can afford to make this transition. Countries can afford to use a bit of the resources to support developing countries to successfully make such a transition. And the speed at which it is happening will be determined by policy processes. And policymakers will be, once this process is kicked off, be interested to be part of this process to make sure that their industry can also shift to climate neutrality, to make sure they benefit and their economies benefit from resilient supply chains, from enhanced recycling. And so the linear picture I've put up here, I think we'll actually be seeing a lot more of an acceleration process in the coming years, similar to what we've seen in the development of electromobility, where the starting point was some projections, and suddenly, as all actors got stronger involved, the process at which a shift to electromobility is anticipated has been accelerated. So for the future energy mix, I think there is a lot of dynamic that will be triggered from policies and new production opportunities in industry. And keep an eye on this. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much for Professor Neuhoff. So next, I would like to invite Mr. Thomas Veyrenc, Executive Director in charge of Strategy Planning and the Evaluation Division at the French Transmission System Operator, RTE. He will present the ongoing large-scale prospective study on a fully decarbonized energy mix by 2050, outlining its different economic and policy implications. So please.
First, I would like to welcome you in Paris for this online conference of the IAEE. And it is a pleasure for me to participate to this conference, and especially to this very interesting session on the future energy mix chaired by Dr. Akimoto. I also want to express my warmest feelings to Laura Cozzi and Karsten Neuhoff, who have led very important work on the topic as well. I also want to express my gratitude to the organization team who had changed its plans several times due to the COVID-19 pandemics. It would have been very nice to welcome you people in Paris for real, and I know the organization team had great plans, but we'll use what we have and we'll try to make a success of this conference anyway. I'm sure we are going to do it. This brings me to my subject, scenarios aiming for net zero by 2050 and ongoing studies in France to build pathways to make net zero not only a motto, but a real strategy that could be implemented. And it is nice that my presentation comes just after that of Laura, because I'm going to discuss in details what is at stake in scenarios of deep decarbonization that share many characteristics with the latest net zero roadmap of the IAEA. But in a given country, France, focusing on electricity, which is going to play a bigger role tomorrow, highlighting policy and social implications. I believe this conference comes at the right time, at least for us, because RTE is in charge to prepare and to conduct a large-scale study on scenarios of carbon neutrality by 2050. And to do so, we consult with stakeholders and we model different possibilities for the power system. Phase 2 of our study will end later this year with our main conclusions, but we just released yesterday an interim paper on the main directions of the study. So I will discuss with you fresh news and provide you with new insights on the debate. This is to say that the definition of roadmaps for reaching net zero is also a matter of finding coherent and realistic pathways that can be implemented in practice and not only in theory. In this slide, I describe the methodology we use in our study. So we know that the massive reduction of CO2 emissions require an increase in electricity end use, an effort, energy efficiency, and more renewables. So the task we have is to explore, to describe, and to quantify the different pathways, and answering technical questions as well as broader ones. Technical questions: how would the electricity demand change? What generation mix do we need to cover our future electricity needs? What kind of modification and transformation should we bring to our energy grids? And how can we make sure that those transformations are going to be resilient to climate change? But we also have broader questions. How much does it cost? What are the consequences for the environment in a broader sense? Can we have, for example, conflicting goals between mitigating climate change on the one hand and other environmental policies on the other hand? What are the social implications of these scenarios? Do they require people to change their lifestyles in terms of transportation, of comfort? So our study is there to answer this simple question: what kind of power system do we need to reach net zero for the whole economy by 2050, the latest? This means that what we are looking for is not to decarbonize the power system itself. So basically, this is almost entirely done in France. It means that what is at stake is how we are going to phase out fossil fuels in sectors where they are massively used today: transportations, buildings, or the industry. Practically speaking, fossil fuels need to be substituted by a mix of electricity, of other low carbon energies, and of energy savings. We know that alternatives to fossil fuels are going to be most costly, at least in the short term, and that structural changes needs to happen in businesses and households. Planning such a change for the next 30 years is fascinating, but also something we should meet with humility. Nobody knows how the society is going to react to those changes. For example, in France, twice in the last 10 years, attempts to put forward carbon pricing in transportation have led to social unrest: red caps back in 2014, yellow vests in 2018, and many economists see the increasing gap between the real price of carbon in the EU ETS or the implicit carbon price of in different sectorial policies and the theory. So first, we need low carbon electricity production in addition to what we have today in order to be substituted to substitute fossil fuels. The second question is what's going to happen to our current generation base? And this relates to a question we very frequently have in the process of designing the scenarios. Why do you want to decarbonize your power sector when you already have a power sector which is almost entirely zero emission? So in France today, 93% of the electricity we have comes from either nuclear reactors or renewables. And the rest comes mostly from gas-fired generation units, keeping in mind that the last coal-fired units are being currently closed down. We have annual emissions that are between 15 and 20 million tons of CO2, so this is far, far below our big neighbors. So this is true, but we also must contemplate what is going to happen in the next decades. First, of course, we need to increase consumption of electricity. This is what I have just discussed. And second, it is now essential to develop an industrial strategy for replacing existing nuclear generators when they reach the end of their lifetime, which is going to happen in any case in the next decades. Our current nuclear generation fleet has been built over a very short period, mostly in the 1980s. 27 out of the 58 reactors we have right now are scheduled to reach a 40-year threshold over the next 5 years. So that means a major industrial program to extend the lifetime of reactors, subject to case-by-case assessment, of course, and approval by the Independent Nuclear Safety Agency. And as of today, there is a kind of broad consensus that current generators may not be operated for more than 60 years. And so the vast majority will be decommissioned between 2030 and 2050 in any case. So that means that France will be confronted with the task of managing the retirement of these nuclear reactors while at the same time expanding the decarbonized electricity supply. And what is, I believe, very important to have in mind is that it's going to happen regardless of the political discussion of recent years about rebalancing the electricity generation mix. What we just have is to have a strategy to replace the capacity to generate 400 terawatt hours per year of decarbonized electricity over the next 30 years. Based on this, we have two main options on the table. First, replacing decommissioned reactors with renewables only. If we choose this option, the share of renewables would reach between 90 and 100% by 2050. Or option two, replacing some decommissioned reactors with new ones. So that means launching a new nuclear program and complementing this with higher shares of renewables. We now have to organize this work. So I give you here the timetable. We're starting the modeling and the collection of hypotheses in 2019, and we devoted most of 2020 to this task. Earlier this year, we published with the IAEA an interim report on the technical feasibility of a system with a high share of renewables. So this report is not about whether this is the best solution. It is about whether it just can work, theoretically speaking. At the same time, we launched a public consultation on all the scenarios. This public consultation was due 2 months ago. We released yesterday the main direction after this public consultation, and our big study is due to be published for the main result later this year, let's say in October. Even if there are good reasons to believe that there should be a clear distinction between two families of scenarios, I think focusing too much on the distinction between nuclear and renewables will be a simplification. First, there are actually many ways to go towards very high share of renewables. So among the three main scenarios we study, what would mean to have a pure 100% renewable power system by 2050, the two others by 2060, with two very different narratives, one with small solar PV distributed all over France, and the other one with big solar onshore and offshore wind farms with the idea to achieve economies of scale. Very, very different pathways. Same is true for scenarios where new nuclear reactors are built, depending on the rhythm of new constructions, on the technologies, on the rate of decommissioning existing units. We can end with a picture very different by 2050, where nuclear would amount to between 20 to 50% of total output. And this is only to discuss generation, because basically there are still important questions pending regarding electricity demand. We are going to implement sensibility checks on GDP, on the industry location. Nowadays, there is a strong desire to mitigate carbon leakage, to also to put an end to the trend of having the industry delocalized in third countries, which have both lower labor costs but also weaker environmental regulations. Also, desire to study in detail energy sufficiency, that is to say, the adoption by the society of different lifestyles. People would be more frugal because they would be more concerned about global warming, about resource depletion, and so on, and they would reduce that would reduce the need for energy. We also investigate a scenario where hydrogen would take off very quickly beyond what is currently expected. So all those trends are there, and we should investigate what it means for electricity demand. So there is a large variety of scenarios being studied. Second point on the slide, despite the sharp differences between scenarios with aiming at 100 renewables by 2050 and another where we would have nuclear power to 50% of generation, maybe those scenarios share many in common on the economic point of view. They both require huge investments upfront. They both result in very low operational costs once the investments are made. They both require a lot of planning, and they question the ability for the society of today to accept new energy infrastructure. So I believe we should also think about the similarities between scenarios. I would now put an emphasis on what's maybe a distinctive feature of the process of elaboration of scenario, which is the very strong involvement in consultation with the public. So basically, our scenarios are elaborated in broad daylight. At each stage of the process, we share the assumption and the results, we discuss narratives with stakeholders, we adjust the process based on the discussion. So we have for these 9 working groups, I'm not going to cover all, from climate modeling to cost and economic analysis. We have meetings, I would say, twice a month with plenty of people, and it's very interesting. To be frank, also very time consuming, but there is a satisfaction to see that we are building, I hope, a strong platform to study the scenario. It also reminds us, when we look at the results of the public consultation, that the debate on energy is far less consensual when we discuss with citizens than when we debate with experts. And I think this is maybe because the consequences of carbon neutrality are not fully materialized by people yet. Among the answers we received from individual citizens, beyond organized groups and beyond professional campaigners, we have often very sharp opinions with either demands for immediate phasing out of nuclear power, or on the contrary, demands for an immediate moratorium on wind power, and desire to keep the nuclear fleet as it is today. In both cases, this would not work with our climate goals, but this is a strong demand from the public consultation of citizens, and we must admit that society remains extremely divided on those issues, and we should keep in mind this for the next stage of the work. At least we have an agreement on how to run the study. Net zero by 2050, everybody agrees on that. Different trajectories and pathways, not just a finish point. And having a complete modeling of the system at European scale with a representation of sector coupling between electricity, gas, heat, and so on. We also have an agreement on what we should study, so a technical analysis of the system with a complete description of the power system, production, demand, and grid, an adequacy analysis per se, with an in-depth assessment of stress tests using different scenarios, climate scenarios from the IPCC. We have the economic analysis what we should do is to perform an overall cost analysis of the system from the society's point of view, which is, we believe, the right tool for policy making, and focus on industry relocation perspectives. We have the description of the environment. So, of course, GHG emissions, footprint, including the life cycle assessment. We have the question of critical mineral resources consumption, spatial footprint of infrastructure, including potential conflicts in land use, and the issue of waste. And last, the description of social issue. So we are not going to explain how the society could or should react, but just to have in mind the implications of each scenario on lifestyles. I'm going just to end with two specific results. The first one on technical question on whether we could run a system with high share of renewables in France. I briefly mentioned some minutes ago the joint report published by the IAEA and RITE earlier this year, after being commissioned by the French Minister for Energy. We concluded that 4 sets of strict conditions were required for technically secure integration of very high share of renewable. So we have the question of system adequacy, so the ability of a power system to cope with load at all times. So this requires the development of many flexibilities, batteries, new thermal units using biofuels or synthetic gas, demand-side response, cross-border interconnection. We also need to have a substantial grid development in those scenarios, much beyond what is necessary in the coming years. We also have, I would say, questions of lesser importance, but still to consider. Maintaining frequency stability. And we believe there is a general scientific consensus that technological solutions are there, such as grid farming, but we should test those solutions in real life in big power systems, and also the sizing of operational reserves and the regulatory framework for balancing responsibilities. I'm going to end my presentation with some economics, just to say that I said earlier that we should compare not LCOEs. This is latently a wrong way to proceed, as it does not take into account cost in flexibilities and in grids. We should run an economic assessment from the point of view of the society. We studied at 2035 horizon 3 policies: transportation with light-duty vehicles, the industry with low-carbon hydrogen, and buildings with a combination of power-to-heat and massive energy restoration. Study shows that action on transportation is at the same time the quickest to achieve emission reductions, the most efficient to do it by large numbers, and the most economic, meaning that the carbon merit order shows that we have abatement costs that are between below and far below the social value of carbon, even when integrating everything: cost of EVs, cost of charging infrastructure. So we have very positive results for transportation. For hydrogen, we also have positive results, but for lower volumes. And for buildings, mainly due to the cost of renovation and the fact that there is a rebound effect. Power to heat is in the money, but massive energy restoration is costly when we compare it to other policies. So as a conclusion, I hope I have not been too long and that you have been interested in this practical experience of designing scenarios in France. I hope you'll enjoy the rest of the session and that we will have fruitful discussions. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Mr. Veyrenc, for interesting presentation. So I'd like to invite the final speaker of this session, Mr. Brent Wanner, head of the power sector unit for the World Energy Outlook at the International Energy Agency, IEA. He will outline the necessary evolution of the world power mix in order to reach a net zero emission target in 2050, as described in the latest IEA report, Net Zero by 2050. So please.
Hello, my name is Brent Wanner, and I'm the head of the Power Sector Unit for the World Energy Outlook at the International Energy Agency, or IEA. Thank you for the opportunity to present to you some highlights focused on electricity from our report, Net Zero by 2050, a roadmap for the global energy sector, that was released on the 18th of May. It's the first global comprehensive study of how to transition to a net zero energy system by 2050. While ensuring stable and affordable energy supplies, providing universal energy access, and enabling robust economic growth. In recent months, many governments and companies have set themselves the target to reach net zero emissions from their economies by the year 2050. Some countries aim to achieve this target earlier, some a bit later. But 2050 is increasingly becoming the target year of climate ambitions. Net zero pledges to date cover around 70% of global GDP and CO2 emissions. However, fewer than a quarter of announced net zero pledges are fixed in domestic legislation, and few are underpinned by specific measures or policies to deliver them in full and on time. And this motivated the report, laying out a roadmap for the energy sector to reach net zero CO2 emissions by 2050. If we take a broad view, global energy-related emissions need to decline by about 40% over the next decade and continue declining towards zero in 2050. While this target is far off in the future, immediate actions are needed to ensure the opportunity of net zero by 2050, narrow but still achievable, is not lost. And electricity has a starring role to play in these clean energy transitions. Today, electricity is the largest emitting energy sector, but there is no shortage of low emission technologies on the market, including solar PV, onshore and offshore wind, hydropower, bioenergy, other renewables, and nuclear power. There are also others in pre-commercial stages, including carbon capture technologies and co-firing hydrogen-based fuels. In our scenario, electricity is the first sector to achieve net zero emissions at the global level around 2040, and as early as 2035 overall in advanced economies. Our report presents in detail a pathway to net zero emissions by 2050, setting milestones along the way for all energy sectors. In total, over 400 global milestones are laid out for technology innovation, technology deployment, and for policy. Of course, every country has its own circumstances and will make its own plans for the transition to net zero, depending on its own priorities. Focusing on the electricity sector, I'd like to highlight a few of those milestones to give a sense of pace and scale involved with the global transition to net zero emissions. First, and from 2021, no new unabated coal-fired power plants should be approved for development. This would make 2021 a clear turning point in the fight against climate change and a clear departure from the past, as over the last decade, more coal-fired capacity was built than any other power generation technology. By 2030, electricity sector emissions are cut by half, aided by the phase out of unabated coal in advanced economies and the deployment of solar PV and wind power passing 1,000 gigawatts per year, which is 4 times the record deployment in 2020. By 2040, electricity reaches net zero globally, with all unabated coal and oil phased out. By 2050, renewables become the dominant source of electricity in our scenario, providing almost 90% of generation and almost 70% from solar PV and wind alone. We also acknowledge that our scenario is one pathway to net zero emissions by 2050, not the pathway. Other pathways are viable, and there are important uncertainties, but the call to action is clear in any scenario that reaches net zero emissions by 2050. The net zero pathway involves both a significant increase in electricity needs and a radical transformation in the way electricity is generated. Despite accelerated efforts on energy efficiency in all sectors, the pace of electricity demand growth picks up around 2030 due to higher economic activity, rapid electrification of end uses, which include heat and transport, and the expansion of hydrogen production by electrolysis. By 2050, global electricity demand is 2.5 times higher than it is today, making the transformation of the electricity sector central to achieving net zero emissions. Fossil fuels without carbon capture, utilization, and storage provide over 60% of global electricity today, but these must be cut rapidly, starting with coal-fired generation. Renewables contribute most to decarbonizing electricity in our scenario. Global generation from renewables nearly triples by 2030 and grows 8-fold by 2050. As a result, renewables rise from 29% of electricity generation to over 60% in 2030 and nearly 90% in 2050. Nuclear power, hydrogen-based fuels, and fossil fuel power plants equipped with CCUS complement that renewable growth. Solar PV and wind race ahead, becoming the leading sources of electricity globally before 2030. From 9% of electricity generation in 2020, solar PV and wind reached 40% by 2030 and nearly 70% by 2050, a radical change in the way we supply electricity. What does it take in terms of deployment and expansion for solar PV and wind to step into this role? In short, it's unprecedented expansion. Solar and wind are mature technologies poised for growth. They have low costs and widespread policy support. Solar PV is among the cheapest new sources of electricity in most markets today, the result of falling technology costs and enjoying the benefit of very low financing costs. Onshore wind is market ready and can rival solar's low costs, but does face some public opposition and lengthy permitting processes in several markets. Offshore wind is a rapidly maturing technology, ready to go global after its development was fostered in Europe. The commercialization of floating turbines would open up further potential for offshore wind in many markets, particularly those with deep waters near shore. 2020 was a record year for the deployment of solar PV and wind. 134 gigawatts of solar PV added, 114 gigawatts of wind capacity added by our latest estimates. But by 2030, we need to be deploying 4 times as much. Over 630 gigawatts of solar PV, nearly 400 gigawatts of wind power. That calls for a massive scale up of the supply chains for those technologies over the next decade. And once electricity is fully decarbonized in 2040, the pace of expansion for solar PV and wind slows to match electricity demand growth. But repowering those aging installations that have already been built or are being built now ensures that supply chains remain active for solar panels and wind turbines through to 2050 and beyond. Overall, solar PV capacity needs to grow 20-fold by 2050 and wind 11-fold. A huge expansion, a key driver for the decarbonization of electricity and the overall energy system. That growth then helps displace fossil fuels without carbon capture and storage or other abatement technologies. One of those key steps to the journey to net zero is to address emissions from coal-fired power plants. Unabated coal-fired generation provided 35% of electricity in 2020, but also accounted for 27% of global energy CO2 emissions. On the path to net zero, unabated coal falls to just 8% of electricity generation by 2030, about half the level that would otherwise be dictated by announced pledges. So a much faster acceleration in that decline going forward, and reversal of the trend that we've seen over the past decade, for example. As coal-fired power plants are the backbone of many power systems, addressing their emissions calls for a multi-pronged approach. One, to repurpose them to focus on providing flexibility rather than baseload power. Two, retrofitting them with carbon capture or to co-fire ammonia. And three, retiring them where other sources are available to step in to maintain electricity security. Unabated coal is entirely phased out by 2040 in our scenario, starting with the least efficient designs. However, a number of the youngest, most efficient facilities continue to operate to 2050 with carbon capture technologies or converted to use ammonia, enabling these existing assets to contribute to clean energy transitions and ensuring and supporting the affordability of those transitions. Now, these massive changes in the way we supply electricity also call for a change in the electricity networks that underpin the system. That investment in electricity networks scaling up will be crucial to the transformations. Global electricity networks took 130 years to build, but need to double in length over the next 2 decades, and then keep increasing to 2050. That calls for total grid investment to reach over $800 billion per year by 2030, several times the level today, and over $1 trillion in 2040. These are higher levels than have ever been seen in the history of electricity and in the history of energy. They fall back somewhat after 2040 as this sector is fully decarbonized. Throughout the period, electricity demand growth is the primary driver for grid investment and expansion, but that massive growth of renewables is also a key driver, connecting new renewables and integrating them into power systems. Replacing the aging infrastructure is the third key driver of investment in grids, and also presents an opportunity to upgrade, to make the grids smarter, more digital, and more prepared for the enhanced flexibility needs that will be required in the future. And that's where I would like to end today's presentation, is focusing on the flexibility needed in these power systems, which is part of the overall energy security package and ensuring energy security in this scenario. These rapid electricity transformations change the face of energy security in a number of ways. Electricity is more at the center of modern economies. Today, electricity is 20% of total final consumption. In the net zero pathway, it's 50% of total final consumption by 2050, putting it more at the heart of all parts of the economy. That greater reliance has both positive and negative impacts on energy security. On the plus side, for energy importing countries, this means many of them become more self-sufficient, as electricity is more domestically produced on average than other fuels. On the other hand, any electricity disruptions become much more costly to economies, calling for improved resilience to climate-related impacts and particularly to cyber attacks. Maintaining electricity security then also requires a range of measures to ensure flexibility, adequacy, and reliability at all times. Currently, the majority of flexibility in power systems is provided by fossil fuel power plants. The hour-to-hour changes in production to match electricity demand. Moving forward, as those fossil fuel sources are phased out or reduced sharply, their contributions to flexibility also declines. To meet, and at the same time, we're looking at flexibility needs increasing 4 times in the net zero pathway, which is much faster than the electricity demand growth at the same time. So electricity demand growth grows 2.5 times, while flexibility needs on an hour-to-hour basis increase 4 times. So how is this met? It's met with a suite of new technologies, a suite of new sources of flexibility. And the 2 largest are demand-side response and battery systems. We're seeing these already in place in markets today, but by 2050, they become the primary means of providing hour-to-hour flexibility in power systems. Additionally, we see hydrogen-based fuels becoming a critical part of the flexibility package, as well as hydropower continuing to play a central role, and other dispatchable renewable energy technologies being key to ensuring the reliability, security, and adequacy of power systems in all hours and for all consumers. And this is a radical change in how we think about the system, how it operates, moving from where we are today to a system of net zero emissions from electricity, underpinning a wider path to overall net zero emissions by 2050 at the world level. So with that, I'd like to conclude, and thank you very much for your attention. Further information is available for free download at IEA.org, including the full report and all the figures with supporting data. Thank you again for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brent Wanner, for the interesting presentation. So I'd like to move to the Q&A sessions, but if you have any questions or comments among the speakers, please. No? It's okay? Yeah.
One comment to Thomas. I think you looked at various scenarios going forward. What do you think is going to provide you, from a power system perspective, more clarity on how much electricity demand will be there, what to dimension the grids for in the next 10, 15 years?
Sorry, Karsten, there was a short interruption in my in the sound when you were asking your question. Could you rephrase it, please?
Yes, sorry. I think you pointed out the important drivers, and I think the IAEA report as well, in terms of changing demand patterns and scale, which obviously makes it quite challenging for a system operator to dimension your grids for this. So where do you think you can take most indications for how much demand there will be, how to dimension the grid needs to meet these expectations?
Yeah, actually, the grid issue is one of the most challenging in the whole study, because it's much easier to run an adequacy study with load and supply. And grid, as you said, it has a very much bigger geographical dimension. So what we are doing is that we are having a kind of translation of this whole perspective for demand in different locations, and then we will be able to simulate a new grid for 2040, 2050. What I believe is that given the current situation we have in France, we have no major problem until 2030, maybe 2035, mainly having to connect offshore wind farms. But after 2035, maybe we will be in the same. We have the need to reinforce, to strengthen the corridors between the north and the south of the country. We were actually lucky because the power grid, which has been built in the 1980s for the nuclear program, is already able to transmit big amount of energy from the south to the north and from the east to the west. But in a situation with many renewables,
Oh, Thomas?
Yeah.
Oh, the final words are missing. Please repeat.
Yeah, I was just saying that in our view, in our simulation, we see that.
Oh, network is not good.
These are secret results so far, so I think.
Yeah, yeah, basically, yes.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? It's okay. So now the discussion will be open to the floor, but we have a lot of questions already. So yes. Oh yes, please wait a moment. So yes, this is for the Professor Neuhoff. How would the carbon prices be connected to carbon capturing and possible payments, incentives for negative emissions? Professor Neuhoff, please.
Yeah. So I think in the refined CBAM model that I characterized, effectively what we would see is that new investments in climate neutral production facilities, which would then also include CCS-based facilities, are covered with carbon contracts for differences. And so this contract for differences would cover the incremental cost of the clean technology compared to a conventional technology, and would therefore pay correspondingly if this is a CCS facility or a hydrogen-based steelmaking facility, the incremental cost for this. And in a way, I think we are in a pretty simple environment, because to make these facilities viable, the incremental costs need to be funded. I think in basic materials, they are just too high for private investors to take these investments otherwise forward. And at the same time, from a WTO perspective, as a national or European government, we cannot support clean facilities by more than what are the incremental costs compared to conventional technologies. Otherwise, it's going to be seen as trade distorting. So I think that makes it for a relatively clear perspective how to take this forward. And the big question we are seeing is, do we have a mechanism in place that covers these costs by the consumers of materials? So industry that uses steel, cement, and so on, will they pay the higher prices for the input materials and therefore fund also the clean technologies? If that is not the case, then one relies on national governments to pay the incremental costs out of their budgets. And this would be something that only very few countries are in a position to do, have the fiscal space to do, have the political motivation to do. And I think from an inclusive transition perspective, it will be important, if you look at Europe, that all industrial regions in Europe are participating and can afford to shift their production to clean processes. And that's why this European instrument will be very crucial for a European perspective. And also why I think international public finance, there's a 100 billion commitment by richer countries to help developing countries in the transition, will be crucial to also ensure that our partner countries can participate in this transition.
Thank you. The second question is for Professor Neuhoff. Is there a risk of shifting more unsustainable plastics to locations with more open policies?
Yeah, I think for me, the starting point really is to look at a picture. How big are cost increases from carbon pricing or climate neutrality compared to the value added on a product, which is the typical metric for carbon leakage risks. And if you look at this, and there have been studies for all countries across the globe over and over again, we always come up with the same solutions, the results. Basic material production is the part which is very carbon intensive. And for these, you suddenly have big cost increases if you have significant carbon prices, or if you go to clean technologies. Pretty much everything else, the cost of energy for manufacturing is relatively moderate. So any cost increases relating to carbon costs or slightly higher energy costs in renewable systems are moderate and don't really have a big location implication. So I think the important message for me is carbon leakage risks are focused highly on these basic material activities. And that has been reflected in all policy design so far, granting free allocation or exemptions from taxes for these processes, and therefore undermining pretty much the transition incentives that we need. And so I think that's why it is important to find policy frameworks at national or regional level that address this incentive feature while avoiding carbon leakage risks. And one option I just outlined to take this forward. I'm quite confident that it works, and I'm interested to see whether this is something that will be taken forward by the European Commission as part of their Fit for 55 package this summer.
Thank you very much. We have perhaps 4 questions for Thomas. So first one is France trying to be independent in the 100% renewable energies, or collaborate with other countries, such as depending on best locations for wind, solar power, and so on. The second one is what is the role of the consumer in the transition? Today, people can choose between sustainable or non-sustainable sources with such as increased prices. Is it possible that people might choose in the future what type of renewable energies or nuclear power they want to use? The third one is the decentralized and independent energy production systems, a possible component of the rural France future to reduce infrastructure. Sorry, Thomas. Fourth, regarding the question of, okay, oh yes, yeah, yes. Oh.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. So, sorry. Yeah. Please.
Yeah. Are we trying to be independent? That basically being independent for power system makes no real sense. So, of course, what we model is a European power system, highly interconnected, because we see that in those kind of scenarios, cross-border integration makes sense. The issue we have basically is that European by essence, and the political discussion remains national. The discussion on nuclear is specific to France. There is one discussion in Germany about coal, about nuclear. It's not the same. Discussion in the UK is something else either. So basically, we have one power system. It is the same, but the political discussion is going to be different in each country, even if there is a further integration through the European Green Deal. I strongly believe that. But we are not going to model power systems that would be independent. In my view, it would be highly, it makes no real sense. Regarding what consumers want, I've spent time during the last years working on smart grids, and maybe I have a small, I mean, what I see is that when we ask people what they want, some of them are ready to engage in some very specific scheme, and basically sometimes they don't even want to be paid for that. They don't really react to the financial incentive, maybe because the price of electricity in France for consumers is very low, but basically they don't seem to react to that. And on the contrary, we have plenty of consumers. What they want is cheap electricity price and not bothering with a highly complex system. And for those consumers, I don't believe they will want to make a kind of trade-off between nuclear and renewables. They want cheap electricity. So I also take that for something important in our job, because of course, the more we have demand response, and it was clear also in Brent's presentation, the more demand response we have, demand response is not expensive. But if people don't want it, we will need to have storage, and then the cost of the scenario does increase. So basically, this is what I believe to answer this question. And for the last one about decentralized and independent energy system production in rural France, very difficult to say. At the moment in France, there is a strong debate on onshore wind. Onshore wind in France is 17 gigawatts. So compared to what Karsten has in his country, it's nothing, pretty much nothing. But there is a kind of a debate about how wind does alter French landscapes, and it's going to be a political debate for the next presidential campaign. So what people want in the countryside, it's not easy to see. If in polls, people near onshore wind does not seem to be unhappy, but there is a strong political debate. Solar PV seems to be easier for people to accept, but when it's difficult to read the society and what they want.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have a lot of questions, but for Brent, demand question appears to be an important vector of flexibility. Yet, Mr. Veyrenc stressed that a large number of consumers mainly want cheap electricity and simple market arrangements. What's your view on this, please?
Thank you, and thanks very much for the question. I think this is a very important point. I mean, as mentioned, that demand-side response becomes one of the largest, if not the largest, sources of flexibility in the longer term. But I think to understand the analysis, actually, we're not asking consumers necessarily to change the behavior or to see a change in services to get to this level. We'll have a lot more electric vehicles on the grid. We'll have a lot more electricity being used for heating, whether that's water or space. And so the level of comfort and services doesn't necessarily need to change because there's a certain amount of inherent flexibility in some of those services. You plug your vehicle in, there may be a window of which it's okay to charge over the next 6 hours or 8 hours, maybe it's shorter, maybe 2 hours, but there is some flexibility kind of inherent in that. So if we can do, for example, the charging of electric vehicles in a smart way, that can already provide quite a bit of flexibility because the vehicle stock will be so large along this pathway. And the same is true on the heating side. Water heating, and this has been done particularly in France for decades, having hot water in the morning is very important for many people to get ready for work and school, but it doesn't particularly matter which hours that the water is actually heated. So combined with energy efficiency, a bit of intelligence, particularly on the consumer electronics side, can greatly unlock a lot of demand-side flexibility, which underpins our scenario. And we leave a lot of that potential still on the table. If we were going a step further and you had, say, vehicle-to-grid flexibility, for example, where you're not just smart charging, but you're also providing power back to the grid at certain times, or if consumers became more active in their role, in their demand in terms of responding to market signals, then there could be even significantly more demand-side flexibility. So I think this is an important question, though, that power sectors around the world will face. How much can demand-side provide flexibility to the same degree of reliability that power plants that are built today and dedicated to this kind of reliability? Can demand-side be relied on to the same degree under the same conditions, even when there's extreme heat or throughout the year? Is this as reliable, and how much can we unlock through smarter and more digital grids will also be an important part of that.
Thank you. Next to Thomas and Brent. How do you see changes to seasonal storage need by power system, and who will provide it in your scenarios? Will it be imports, domestic hydrogen and synthetic fuels, or something else? Please, Thomas is first.
Yeah, it's clear that we, in scenarios in which we head towards 100% renewables by 2050 or 2060, we will need seasonal storage, no doubt about that. Will it be from import, domestic hydrogen or synfuels? Difficult to say. part of it through domestic hydrogen production. There is a strong incentive now to develop hydrogen production. Imports is not in the French national strategy. It's not, we are not supposed to import a lot by 2050, but it remains to, I mean, the economics of imports versus domestic production needs to be checked. It's not going to be the same for hydrogen or for e-methane or e-methanol. So basically, there is a wide variety of possibilities. In scenarios when we have new nuclear power, new nuclear reactors, it's likely that a part of the need for seasonal storage will be much less. But still, we will. But at the maximum level of nuclear power in France by 2050 is 50%. It's no longer to be. It's impossible to see nuclear power as being more than 50%. So we will still have needs for seasonal storage, in my view. What I can be sure, what I believe is that seasonal storage is going to be more efficient than batteries for providing this kind of need.
Brent, how do you think about?
Absolutely, and I agree very much with what Thomas has just said. I mean, it's no doubt that seasonal storage will be needed and will be a big challenge. In our net zero scenario, we're reaching 70% of electricity generation from wind and solar PV in 2050 worldwide. That means some regions are higher than that, and some regions are slightly below that. But to give you an idea, only 2 countries in the world get more than 40% of their electricity from wind and solar PV, and they're relatively small markets. So we're moving also into uncharted territory. I think that's worth saying, but we have been moving the horizon of experience outward as we go, and that shouldn't stop us from taking action today. These challenges of seasonal storage will appear along the way, but we have quite some time before the most severe impacts will appear. In terms of how we actually meet that, I think we, in the modeling that we've done, so we look at the hourly level in several large markets, so we can see this kind of seasonality. One key aspect is that we need to be sure to deploy wind and solar PV and other renewables in a system-friendly mix. We need to make sure that they align as much as possible with demand patterns, that what we're adding in the 2030s and in the 2040s is aligned to what the system needs. So I agree very much with the comment I believe Karsten made about not comparing LCOEs. We need to be thinking about what the system impact, Thomas said this, the system impacts and kind of the system view on costs are more important than the individual technology costs. And that's more and more true the further out we go. We do see quite a large role for hydrogen-based fuels in the long run as a means of providing this seasonal storage, because it can be a way to obviously take excess generation from one part of the year, shift it, this is essentially power to X, creating hydrogen-based fuels that may or may not be used directly in power, but have a value themselves, and then consuming hydrogen-based fuels at other parts of the year, which we see as an important part of not only broadening the suite of low-emission technologies, but also using the existing infrastructure. We have very large coal-fired power, very large fleets of coal-fired power plants and gas-fired power plants in the system today. Extending those lifetimes and helping them complement the transition will be very important. And part of that is converting those or co-firing those to use hydrogen-based fuels.
Thank you. To Karsten, what is the welfare implication of low carbon industry transition? Karsten, please.
For me, I think the biggest welfare implications result if we fail to implement good policies. I think if we have a good set of policies and get this pathway done well, I think then it's going to be relatively moderate cost altogether compared to overall GDPs and economies. And as Thomas and Brent just pointed out, for example, this question of how to make sure that we get system-friendly deployment of renewables. That means that today's investments need to be pursued in a manner that is aligned with the needs in 10 or 15, 20 years. And I think this is something that is at the moment not really well reflected, because most investors don't look that far into the future in terms of how the system will evolve. And it's also difficult to account today of the system benefits you get in 10 or 15 years because they're uncertain. It depends on the storage and all the other elements. And so I think in the power sector, it's about design elements like contracts for differences. If you run auctions for contracts for differences for renewables, to make sure that the clearing price considers the system friendliness. So Mexico had a great design that allows you to kind of project prices into the future and look then at the market value of assets into the 10, 15-year horizon, and then use this in terms of awarding contracts, and therefore giving the investors today already the right incentives. If you ask about basic materials, I think these are one of the few things where you really have persistent higher costs, as I pointed out earlier on, in terms of making them, producing them. But how much are they at the end? If you kind of go to clean processes, I think we are at the order of 300-400 euro per car additional cost for cleanly produced materials, perhaps even less depending on how we get a material efficiency. If we look at this at the terms of final consumers, cost increases of a 30 euro carbon price for the entire expenditure pattern of a consumer are 0.2%. And richer households have even a slightly higher increase, poorer households less so because they buy less new cars. So actually, at the society's perspective, it is really a moderate impact that we can deal with in the specific sector. Every sector is different. Heating, transport might be somewhat more challenging in terms of the distributional aspects, but it is something, if the policy takes it serious and kind of designs it well, I think the social and the economic overall impacts are rather moderate. And so that's why I think the roadmap of the IAEA is really helpful to early on get clarity, where are we going, that was Thomas was saying as well, to make sure that we align our policies now with its needs in the future. Because having sunk investments in the wrong technologies, I think that could be expensive, or delaying the transition and losing entire areas of industrial activity. I think this would be really painful for our societies.
Okay, thank you very much. We have only 3 minutes left, so please, final words, very briefly. First, Thomas, but Karsten is okay. So, so please, Thomas, very brief, please.
No, I don't have anything specific to say. I think the discussion is very interesting because I believe we are just designing the first generation of scenarios for net zero. Brent told about one for the world. We are doing it for France in a very detailed manner. There's the question of the industry that has been dealt with by Karsten, and it is very different to have net zero scenarios rather than the one we had 5 years ago with when we were heading towards a division by a factor 4 of the emission compared to 1990. So having scenarios when we should completely phase out the use of fossil fuels is in my view a much bigger step. I think the society as a whole has not completely thought yet about what it really means.
Okay, thank you. Brent?
Yes, I would just underscore that to this point that we need to make the next decade the one of action, or one of action already, building on what we know how to do, the policies that have been successful, the technologies that are ready to start down this pathway, and to keep the door open to achieving our most ambitious climate goals. That's going to mean a lot of changes already in the system, new experiences, proving the way as we go, but we also need to be laying the groundwork then on the technology side through innovation support, through research and development, to clear the path for the decades that follow that. But this is, many of the questions are, how do we address the issues in the long run? But we need to take very serious action and bend the curve now to make sure that we're on the right track in the meantime.
Okay, thank you very much. Unfortunately, time is over, so I'd like to close this session. Again, thank you very much for the very fruitful discussions, and I was very interested in, and also I enjoyed very much this session. In closing, I'd like to thank all of the speakers for their contributions, and also thank the audience for many suggestions and comments. Okay.